Hello, it's Kat, and in this week's tutorial, I want to show you how I take an illustration like this from flat to finished. We'll be digging into this file, and I'll show you some of the techniques that I use to add detail, texture, dimension, and shading to give your illustration a more polished look. This tutorial is meant for more advanced users, but if you're new to Illustrator, you should still be able to pick up some handy tips. If you're interested in following along or checking out the final project file, I've included information on how you can access these files and bonus content in the description down below. Now let's jump in and take a look at how you can add some nice visual detail to your flat vector illustrations. The first thing we'll take a look at here is how I made the pumpkin facial shapes look more like they were cut into the pumpkin rather than just sitting on top. Before I start applying any shadows, what I usually do is try to picture where the light sources are coming from. So if you look at my finished version, what I've sort of pictured here is that we have one light source coming directly from the front, and then we would probably have another light source that's almost top down, but a little bit here from the right. So keeping in mind those light sources that I've sort of mentally defined here, I want the darkest shadows of the pumpkin face shape to fall directly towards the center of the pumpkin. So swapping back to our flat file here, let's take a look at the basics of the process using this eye as an example. So how I usually go about this is I will select the shape, duplicate it using Control-Command-C and Control-Command-F, which is copy and paste in front. Now I have two identical shapes that sit directly on top of each other. And what I'll do is scale this toward center where I'm creating my shadow. One trick I like to use for getting really nice saturated shadow colors is to keep my base color. And then with my shadow shape selected, I'll go into my transparency panel and swap the blending mode to multiply. And then I usually turn it down until I have about the level of contrast that I want. In this case, that'll be at about half opacity. And I feel like that gives me a nice little step from my base color to my first shadow color. Then what I'll do is grab that first shadow shape and go ahead and duplicate it using Control-C, Control-F, and again, scale that toward the center. And because we've duplicated the first shadow shape that's already set to multiply, your third duplicate will already have that mode applied. So if we zoom out here, you can see how that's subtle, but it definitely adds a bit of dimension going in the right direction. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the rest of the shadows that I use this exact process for. So you can see how just duplicating the shapes and changing blending modes can start to give you this really nice depth. I've repeated that in all of the pumpkin facial features, as well as used it to add a shadow here under the stem, and it's also repeated more subtly in the ghost character in the background. So next, let's take a look at how I added detail and texture to the stem. I'm going to swap over to my finished illustration here and just zoom in a bit. For the stem, what we want to do is picture it in 3D as well as you can. I find that having references definitely helps with this. And what I want is to give the illusion that the stem is twisted around. And then it has some ridges and valleys here in the vine. The technique is very much the same, at least at the beginning. What I will do is duplicate the main path of the stem shape, and then I'll begin removing parts of it. So let me show you how we go about doing that. We'll swap back over to our flat version here. I'll go ahead and select my stem shape and duplicate that. We'll change the duplicate to multiply, knock it down to about 48% opacity. Now I want to start separating this shape into smaller shapes. There are a lot of different tools and methods that you can use to do this part. My go-to for this part of the process is using the knife tool. And this will allow me to just freehand sweep over the shape and divide it into smaller shapes. What I'm going to attempt to do here is cut out where I want to see light. So I know that there's a strip of light that goes sort of from this part of the stem up around. What we're trying to do is make that illusion of a spiral. So I'll just do 2 quick sweeps over here. And then if I go ahead and select this center shape that we've made and delete, you can see that we've got kind of the effect of a light happening there. One thing to note with the knife tool is that you do have to have your shape that you want to affect selected first. So I'll go ahead and select this part and go back to my knife tool. And I know I want a little shadow down here, so I'm just going to cut that part out, delete this. So we've got our light here as well. And so if you think about a pumpkin vine, you'll know that there's alternating ridges. And that's kind of the effect we're trying to create here. So once you start making your cuts, then you're going to need to refine these shapes. And you can start with your direct select tool, that's A on your keyboard, and just sort of start manipulating your curves here. And so this process will obviously look different for everything that you're drawing and will depend on your personal art style. But I find that starting with blocking out the shadows and lights gives me a visual cue of where I want to add more detail. I'm going to quickly just delete this demo shape here and then turn on the actual layers in the finished illustration one by one so you can see how those work. So my first set of pieces here is what I would have gotten from right after the knife process. And then there's 2 more kinds of detail that I have here in the stem. One would be an example of this path where it's just another layer. If I go in, you can see it's multiply and it's set a little bit higher, around 68%. And it's just layering with this shape underneath, and it creates this deeper shadow right in the middle here for some nice depth. And you can see how the shape of the swash follows the curve that I'm trying to bring out in the spiral of the stem. So we've got a few more of these, and they would be the same. They've got multiply and 68. So these are just slightly darker shadows that we're adding, nothing fancy, but all together they layer to give this illusion of more depth. And then we have a couple of lighter shadows, and this is really just same concept. We're using the same base color for all of this. This is multiply as well. And these small marks are just encouraging the textured look to the vine. Here are some more subtle diffused shadows. And if we take a look at these paths, the shape is still following the main stem shape, but this shape, if I go into the appearance panel, we're still using the same base color, and it is in multiply mode. Its opacity is much lower, 24%. And then to give it a much more subtle look, this also has a feather effect applied. I'm using a radius of 9 pixels here, but of course you can adjust that for whatever style you're going for. One thing to note, if you are going to use a feather or Gaussian blur effect, you will want to go into your effects menu and check out your document raster settings. If you are creating this for something print, you'd probably be in CMYK mode, but you would also want to check your resolution here and make sure it's up to 300 if you need high resolution graphics. Back in my layers panel here, you can see that I've only got 2 of those, and they're just to add a subtle shadow to the center of the light parts here. This is a detail you probably wouldn't notice if you're looking at the final version and not zoomed in super close, but all of these things do really add up, and the layering of these kinds of shapes and subtle effects is how we get to an end result like this. So next we'll be taking a look at the body of the pumpkin and how we achieved the dimension there. So I'll switch back over here to my flat version, and I'll zoom in just a little bit. Now, if we turn on all of the effects at once, you can see how that kind of gives a complete effect. I do have these split up into 3 groups. One would be the shadows. If you take away shadows, you can see the highlights and then the lines, which give that classic pumpkin shape where you see the rounded ridges. So when I started the shading process for the pumpkin, I put down the lines first because this really helps me to visualize where my lights and shadows will be. For example, I know that between the lines would be where the highlights go, and toward the top, because that's where our secondary light source is coming from. And I know that the bottom of the pumpkin here will be in shadow, and that the shadows will deepen as they get closer to the lines where there's these natural dents between the ridges of a pumpkin. It's really helpful to have some photo reference available of actual pumpkins that help you visualize what these would look like and how to go about simplifying and stylizing where those lights and shadows fall. So for the lines that I've put down here, this is just a simple stroke. And if we go into the appearance panel and open up the stroke settings, it's got a width profile included to make it a little thicker in the center and tapered towards the edges. This is a default width profile in Illustrator, so you can go ahead and experiment with that. The stroke weight is around 12 pixels for this. And I'm using the base color of the pumpkin, and the line itself is in multiply mode with an opacity of 48%. The next thing that I did was to start creating shadow shapes. To give you a little bit of a better visualization of the shadow layers, I'm going to turn off the facial features and the stem and the ghost, just to simplify things down. Pressing Control and toggling the visibility here, I'm just going to toggle the shadows into outline mode so you can see the general shape. What I've done here is we're drawing along the shape of the pumpkin, and then the deeper shadows are coming up along following these lines. I'll swap this back to full color here by Control-click or Command-click, and let's just take this down to the first shape that we made that's very basic. So what I actually did here was follow the same process for the stem. I duplicated the pumpkin shape, and then I used my knife tool to go ahead and cut out from the top. This shape is using the same fill color as the base of the pumpkin. And if we go ahead into our appearance panel, you can see that its opacity is at 86% and its blend mode is at multiply. Now here's where it's a little bit different. If I go into the fill here, you can see that I actually have a gradient going on. So I'll bring up my gradient tool using the keyboard shortcut G so you can see that gradient. It's got 2 color stops that are both the base color of the pumpkin, keeping things nice and simple. And if I go into my gradient panel here, this color stop towards the top is at 0% opacity. And the color stop at the bottom is at 100% opacity. So what we're doing is fading the multiplied layer from no color at the top to full color. The gradient is angled in the direction that I'm picturing the light coming from. Also, you'll notice that the edges are feathered. So if I go back into my appearance panel, you'll see that feather effect. And for this, we're just a little over 20 pixel radius, which of course you can adjust based on your style. So with the pumpkin body and the ghost body, what I've done is stacked basically a bunch of these shapes with very soft shadows and gradients that follow the direction of the light to shadow. Popping back into our layers palette here, I'll just show you the second shape that I made. This one is slightly more irregular. It definitely started in the same fashion, again with duplicating the pumpkin base and then cutting out or adjusting paths to show where the light and shadows are falling. This one is meant to give a little deep shadow to the divots at the bottom of the creases here, defined by our pumpkin lines. This is just another layer of basically the first shape that's a little bit softer. Here's another layer that is following our lines to encourage those shadows all the way up where the divots would be between the ridges of the pumpkin. Here we have a layer that is just an exact copy of the pumpkin, but if I go into the appearance panel here, and take a look at the fill, you can see that that is actually a radial gradient. So what I've done here is 2 color stops of the same color. The center one here will be 0%, going out to 100% opacity at the edges. And that 0% just means that it's actually transparent in here. So the multiply effect is only taking into account the edges here where we've got 100% of the color blending. So the gist of this is the same as anything else we've been doing. We're layering shapes based on the outside shape and blending them together to create shadows and light, which gives the illusion of dimension. So now let's take a look at the highlights layer. This is basically the opposite of the shadows, and it's really easy once you have your shadows in to see where the lights should fall. We want to focus on the center of these ridges, that would be the highest, and then we want light to concentrate towards the top and slightly to the right because that's where our imaginary light source is from. The first thing that I did is duplicate the entire pumpkin shape, and then if we go to our appearance panel, you can see that this is filled with a radial gradient with the color concentrated in the center, fading to completely transparent at the edges. The one big change when you're making highlights versus shadows is we want to use a different blending mode. So what I typically use is screen mode, and screen is basically the opposite of multiply. So it'll give you some nice saturated highlight color. I just like to stack the base color. And I find that this keeps my highlights and shadow colors nice and saturated and keeps that hue really front and center. Now switching back to my layers panel, we'll just take a look at the shapes of the other paths that I've drawn. Some of these I've literally just drawn a loose shape that follows exactly where the bulge would be on this ridge of the pumpkin. And if we go into the fill color here, this one we've gotten a little fancy and we're using a freeform gradient. So I'm going to click Edit Gradient to pull up that menu. And the freeform gradient is really interesting because you can control very minutely where you're putting your points of light and color. So you can add color stops individually. And because I have the entire shape set to screen mode, wherever I click, I'm adding the base pumpkin color, but it is blending with the background in a way that creates a highlight. You can use both line mode or point mode to draw your highlights in. And if you lose your color, you can just double click on one of these stops and set it back to the proper pumpkin color. Let me just delete those extras. If you're interested in a more detailed demonstration of using the freeform gradient in particular to do shading, I suggest watching this peach shading video that I did last year, in which I used pretty much only freeform gradients to create this effect. So you can see a little preview here in the gradient window of what this shape actually looks like if I were to turn off all of the other layers. And basically we're just applying the light where we want it to fall. I've done the same process with a couple of other shapes that I just loosely drew with the curvature tool to fit these pumpkin ridges. So you can see that repeated. And then we have a highlight at the top here, which is another complete duplicate of the pumpkin shape with that radial gradient and the light concentrated here. I'll bring up the gradient annotation tool so you can see where this is coming from. So this stop is what is creating the light, and you can make it brighter by adjusting that position, or make the drop off smoother by adjusting the position of the lower stop. So it's a circular light source that we're creating with a radial gradient. And screen mode, if I pop into the appearance panel here with that shape selected, you can see that that is at 80% opacity, and again in screen. And just like the shadows, these all stack with each other to create this nice illusion of light and shadow. I'll go ahead and turn the face and the stem back on and our ghost and just zoom out here. So you can see how this really comes together. We've got our simple stacked shapes with the facial features, the details that we added to our stem, and then with our lines, shadows, and highlights on the pumpkin shape, you've got something much different than the very flat shape that we started with. Just want to take a really quick look at the ghost because it uses a lot of the same concepts before we move on to the background. So for the ghost here on the tail, I started with this full shape that's just pure white. That's the base color of my ghost. I decided to use the shadow color here. That is the bluish purple. It's part of the palette you can grab in the project files. And I'll just go ahead and turn on the shadow layer. This is just a duplicate of the base, and I've applied a gradient here. So I'll use G to bring up my gradient tool and pop open the panel. Let's move this over so you can see. This is a radial gradient with the shadow color at the center, and I've started it behind the pumpkin here, and we're angling up here. So it appears that the light is hitting the end of the ghost's tail. On the other side, I wanted the shadow to again come from behind the pumpkin, but also this area of the ghost would be in shadow because the light will be hitting from this angle. So the brightest part of the ghost would be his forehead right here. So we've got a base layer that's pure white. You can see the shape there. So I'll go ahead and turn on my first shadow layer on the ghost. It follows the shape of the base ghost. And so what I would have done here is duplicate the shape, make it larger, and then used my knife tool to just carve out where I want the light to sit and deleted that. That's how we get the shape. And then if we take a look at the appearance panel, you can see that this is 33% opacity. I'm using that blue-purple color for the shadow throughout all of these shadow layers for the ghost. And the feather is pretty pronounced here. If you take a look, we've got it at 60 pixels. Because this shape is larger than the base ghost on this side, it gives a subtle shadow between the ghost and the background. Going back to our layers panel here, I will just turn these on one by one. I'm using basically the same concept with almost the same shape, and we're just layering it. And I built it up so that the deepest shadow would be down here by the pumpkin. And because it's so feathered, we kind of get this backlighting effect where there is a little bit of light on the edge, which helps make the lighting look more realistic. I'll just show you how many layers are actually here by toggling this really quickly to outlines. We're just progressively stacking shapes until we get the shadows as deep as we want them and have that nice gradient effect with the light coming here and hitting the ghost's face so that that is the brightest part of the character. Now that we have our character shaded, the background is looking a little flat, so let's take a look at how I went about making that look more dimensional. First thing that I did was add shadows underneath the pumpkin, and this is actually in a clip group because the shadow shapes extend off of the artboard. But if we take a look at the individual paths here, I start at the bottom of the stack with a very large shadow shape that will be really soft and subtle so that we can build up darker shadows where we want them on top. And if we go and take a look at this, we're back in multiply mode because we're working in shadows. This one's around 55%, and we've got a very large feather effect set here. The stack progresses like this with smaller shapes as we go along. For this, you can see that I've actually just duplicated that first one and scaled it down. And if we look at the appearance, it's actually got the exact same feather and multiply mode set. And because they are in multiply mode, that shadow color will continue to build. And I'll give you a quick view of the outlines. I've just stacked shapes until I got to the point where I felt like the shadow was dark enough right under the pumpkin and that it diffuses out towards the edges. Also, you'll notice that they are stacked more to the left because, again, that light is coming from up here. So slightly to the right, the darkest shadows would be right here under the pumpkin. And then once you have that in, the last step on the background is to add a vignette. You could just add one shape to do this for a very simple look. I'm all about the layers when it comes to adding depth. So I actually have 3 shapes to create the depth of color that I want. And if we look at the first one, we're using radial gradients where I'm using the same base color on both color stops with the opacity being 0 in the center here and the opacity being 100 at the edges here. If I swap to the next layer, I've just made some adjustments. What I'm really trying to do is make the corners much darker and the center that's behind the characters a bit lighter so that we're drawing the eye continually back to the center of the illustration. So again, it's all about stacking, layering, and blending to start creating that depth. The very last layer we're going to take a look at is the grain layer, which is subtle but does make a difference, and I'll show you how I applied that. To show this in action, I'm going to turn off the grain layer. Let's make a new one to show you how I made it. First, I did a square around the entire artboard that is the same size as the entire artwork. And I want to fill that with a medium gray color. Now we'll go into the effect menu and go down to texture, grain. I'm not sure of the exact settings I used for this because I did make this illustration originally a year ago, but what you can do is mess with the contrast and intensity settings here to see how fine you want your grain. And I'm going to leave mine around 80 for intensity and right about in the middle for contrast. I have my grain type set to sprinkles, but you can certainly experiment with different types. So this looks good. I'm going to hit OK here. And then in my transparency panel here, I'm going to set this to multiply. That is pretty intense and the grain looks a little bit too dark. So then what I want to do is bump the opacity down again to around 38%. And now what I want to do is fade out the grain in the same places where I have most of my highlights. So what we'll do for that is go back into our transparency panel and we're going to make a mask. Now to edit the mask, you'll want to click here and you'll notice that your layers panel switches to opacity mask. To get back to your artwork, you'll have to go back into this panel and click into the artwork so that you can see everything again. So let's go ahead and edit this mask. So by default, I can no longer see my grain because the mask is just a solid black shape. When you're using masks in Illustrator, white reveals and black conceals. So I'm actually going to grab my rectangle tool, make a rectangle that covers the entire artwork here, and I'm going to set the fill color to white, and now you can see that we can see our mask again. Now what I want to do is add black where I'll be concealing the grain. So what I'll do here now is make sure I don't have the square selected. I'm going to change my fill color to pure black and grab my curvature tool. And I'm just going to create some shapes where I know I want to conceal the mask. I do have a full tutorial on the curvature tool if you're not familiar with this. It's a wonderful tool, very beginner friendly. So I know I want light here on the ghost's face. I'm just tapping once to create these curves. And you can see that where I'm drawing these shapes, they're not turning up black even though I have my fill set to black because we're in mask editing mode. So what it's actually doing is just hiding the grain. So I'll just adjust my shapes here. I'm going to do just a few on the pumpkin's face. And the other nice thing with the curvature tool is that you can adjust your shapes on the fly without having to change to other tools by just clicking and dragging on any of your points or on the line that you've drawn. So I do use this tool all the time for quick shape making. This is what I use to create the shadow shapes, for example, and a lot of the highlight shapes on the pumpkin. Any shape that can be a little bit loose is really quick and easy to draw with the curvature tool. So the last place that I want to highlight here by getting rid of the mask will be a little shape on the tail. So now that I have these shapes drawn in, I'm going to select all the shapes that I've drawn except for the rectangle. So I'll just lock that so it's not part of my selection. And I want to feather all of these so that there isn't a harsh line between where the grain stops and starts. So just like with any other shapes, even though we're working in a mask here, I can go to my appearance panel, down to effects. I'll go up here to stylize and then hit feather. And we want something much lower than that. Let's try 30 pixels, give that a preview. So around 30 pixels gives us a nice little feather. Just do that and then deselect. So now you can see how the grain is fading towards the edges. And of course, I've just done this really quickly for demonstration purposes. You would probably want to adjust a little bit more depending on the final style of your illustration and your preferences. So when you're done with your mask, you'll want to switch back to your transparency panel and make sure that you just click back into the artwork to stop editing the mask. You can always go back and edit that later. It's nice and non-destructive. So you can tweak that as much as you want to get it looking right. Let's go ahead and turn on the original mask, which you can see was a little bit more subtle, probably because I spent more time adjusting there. But you can see the effect of less grain in the highlight areas and more grain in the shadows. And I just kind of like that as a style. So once we have everything in, I just want to show you really quickly what the entire image looks like in outline mode. It does look like a lot of shapes, but as we were going along, it's really not that complex to make the shapes, especially the stacking of the facial features where you're really just duplicating and scaling. And a lot of it's just copy and paste and adjusting opacities or fills. So we can easily go from something like this with a little bit of work to our final image here. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, do feel free to leave them in the comments. I'm always happy to help. If you're looking for the files, the information is found in the description down below. As always, hope you have a wonderful day and happy illustrating.